Today's presentation will be given by Lynette H. Ong, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and Asian Institute, Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and she is the author of Prosper or Perish, Credit and Fiscal Systems in Rural China from Cornell University Press, 2012. She has many publications in Comparative Politics, China Quarterly, International Political Science Review, Foreign Affairs, and also many opinion pieces in journals and newspapers and magazines. Her research focuses on China, followed by East and Southeast Asia. She's fluent in Mandarin Chinese, Bahasa Malaysian, and various Chinese dialects. And she was the An Wang Postdoctoral Fellow at Harvard University Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies in 2008-2009. Lynette has her PhD from Australian National University. Today she will be speaking on contracting out violence, patron-client relationships between the government and thugs in China. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Mary, for the introduction and for inviting me to University of Michigan, and thanks everyone for coming. So this is a paper about relationship between state and thugs. Just to give you a little bit of some background. It's actually an offshoot of my ongoing project on taxation, land expropriation, and social unrest. So I go to China regularly, interview people and try to talk to them about land expropriation. But whenever I try to ask them questions about land, they would say, come, I'll tell you things about thugs and violence and what they have done to us. So that began to pique my interest. And secondly, in my last book project, Prosper or Perish, I have observed very strong relationship between local government officials and local business elites, particularly managers of township and village enterprises. But over the last couple of years, what I have seen is the rise of a new class of people who use violence in what they do, thugs and gangs. And these people have a very close or cozy relationship with the local government. So this paper is very much an exercise to help me make sense of these new observations and what it means for state-society relations. So this is a very preliminary project, first time that I'm presenting it, so I would very much appreciate any feedback or comment. Violence with thuggery and gangsterism and organized crime are on the rise in China. In Maoist China, the Chinese Communist Party's tentacles that extended into all aspects of the society, either to spread ideology or to maintain control, was also credited for eradicating, mafia and gangsters, which were pervasive during the Republican periods. This is no longer true in the reform era. So thugs, gangsters, and crime syndicates are actually making a comeback, as well as is the associated violence is re-emerging in contemporary China. So this paper looks at state-related thuggery, particularly thugs who have been hired by the state to get certain jobs done. Why does the state hire thugs but not other people? Because thugs are known for using violence in their execution, right? So I call this contracting out violence by the state. And in this paper, I'm not so interested in mafias or criminal gangs that are involved in drugs and arms smuggling, prostitution, and other vices. While they are, of course, related, my primary interest here is really those criminals who take on a job from the state and use violence in their execution. So who are the common subjects against this which violence are being used? So thugs and gangsters are most frequently recruited when the state or state agents deal with peasants and urban residents in cases of land expropriation, demolition, relocation, and housing eviction. So in Chaiqian projects. Also in collection of rural taxes and fees, particularly in the 90s. And the problem was so serious that when Hu Jintao came into power in 2000s, his administration eventually abolished all the rural taxes and fees. And one major reason was because of a lot of violence used in the collection of these fees and exactions. There's also chengguan, or city patrols, who deal with vendors, street vendors and hawkers in maintenance of city street order. The picture here shows a chengguan in Hunan who was holding an axe when doing his job. I don't think the use of an axe is justified under any circumstance. And then you have petitioners, activists, and protesters. They are also, violence are also frequently used against them. And this does not rule out the fact that violence is actually involved in a wide range of scenarios, but they are most commonly used when dealing with these subjects. So why are violence used against these subjects? Well, I think the primary reason is it's difficult to get compliance from citizens with state directives. Peasants would resist demolition, land expropriation, and relocation for a wide range of reasons, right? It could be because of low compensation, because of lack of consultation over the relocation process. It could be because of, they are forced to move to these high-rise apartments, but the resettlement housing is actually of very inferior quality, so they refuse to move. It could be because of corruption, embezzlement of compensation by government officials, a wide range of reasons, and people might refuse to comply with state directives. And precisely because compliance is difficult, the state and state agents need to use violence and employ tactics such as intimidation, coercion, arm twisting to effectuate desired outcomes. And city patrols, or chengguan, they are agents of municipal governments who are tasked with implementing and enforcing local urban management bylaws, rules, and regulations, and to manage and to maintain urban management order. As distinct from the police or military, chengguan are unarmed municipal officials responsible for managing order in the municipality. They have very meager resources in terms of personnel and funds to do their jobs properly, and relevant laws on their functions and duties are actually ambiguous and ill-defined, which leaves much room for manipulation by individual officials. And so, given the budget constraints as well as mounting tasks, city patrol departments often hire temporary or auxiliary workers to supplement its own workforce. And these temporary workers use violent and coercive force to collect city management fees, fines, and to eradicate, unlicensed vendors who are usually rural migrants who don't have much social status in urban areas. And some of these auxiliary city patrols, they are gangs and they are gangsters and thugs, while others are just workers who are willing to employ whatever means they can to execute their tasks. And I think the other reason that thugs and gangsters are hired is because of accountability avoidance. Outsourcing violent acts to third parties has the added advantage of avoiding accountability if they were caught in action. And since it's violent and bullying tactics are often against the law, their execution is best contracted to third parties. So who are these thugs and gangsters? What are their backgrounds? What are the kind of the organizational structure? These thugs and gangsters, they belong to some organized groups. But even though the nature of their organizations is not particularly sophisticated, they could be part of the criminal gang, mob, or professional security company, 保安公司. They lack the sophisticated networks that characterize most criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking, arms and drug sales, and other vices with extensive networks nationally or sometimes internationally. These individuals, I think, should be seen as thugs for hire. So I call them violent entrepreneurs because they provide to clients services that involve the use of violence. Most of these violent entrepreneurs, they have criminal records, which creates obstacles for their acquiring proper jobs and their reintegration into the society. And they are not particularly well educated either. These thugs tend to be recruited from other regions rather than locally for the convenience of an escape route if they got into trouble. There are some, I have managed to find some secondary material. There are some infamous kingpins, such as there's this guy called Qiao Si in Harbin, Liu Yong in Shenyang. They had made their fortunes by offering hired thuggery services to state agents in demolition and eviction projects in various cities. Qiao Si was known as the underground mayor in the city of Harbin in the 90s. When he was put on trial in the mid-2000s, he had nearly 100 accomplices. He began making money in the thuggery for hire business in 1987 when the city underwent urban development and renewal. Working with various construction companies, there were government contractors in demolition projects. He would organize and send demolition teams to assist the local government in demolition and relocation works. The teams were made up of thugs who utilized violence to effectuate forceful demolitions and evictions. And thereafter, he grew his empire by branching out into construction and entertainment businesses. But it was in thuggery for hire, in demolition and relocation projects, where he made his first bucks. So Qiao Si's success could really be attributed to his ability to supply the services in demand by the clients. His services helped improve job effectiveness and cost efficiency for the local government. When these criteria are prioritized ahead of citizens' welfare, thuggery for hire becomes an area where genuine market demand exists. So I say that is effective because when you get a bunch of people who wouldn't comply with your policies and your directive, you just send a bunch of people to use violence. You know, it's the most effective way of getting job done. Cost efficiency there might be some nail households which would held up the entire land expropriation projects, and by sending the thugs in, it just improved the efficiency of the projects. So if we were to divide the use of force and the purpose it is used for into public and private, at one end you have force that is public force being used for public purposes, and so you have the police and the military. At the other extreme, or at the other end of the continuum, you have private forces being used for private purposes, mafias, thugs, and organized crime. And then these two quadrants are crossover between private and public, which are more controversial. So what we are talking about here is really the use of private violence or private force being used for public purposes, state use of private agents to carry out violence for public purposes. I want to spend a little bit of time to think through the theoretical implications of the emergence of thugs and violence. I think there are two sorts of relationship between state and these violent entrepreneurs. One is a principal-agent relationship. So when The state, being the principal, contract out the service to the thugs as the agent. There's an agency problem. The state cannot effectively monitor or to control what the agent does. So the war on terror since 9/11 has also increased the demand for private security forces, for private security services, from foot soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan to interrogators in Abu Ghraib prison. And one of the U.S. contractors is Booz Allen and Hamilton, where Ed Snowden works or used to work. Deborah Evans, in her study of privatizing security by sovereign states, differentiates among three types of control. You have political control, which is about who is calling the shots of the use of force or violence, use of force. And then you have functional control, about who gets to decide for what function or for what purpose the force is used for. And the third one is social control. To what extent are the use of force reflect prevailing social values and social norms? And it's not difficult to imagine that these various dimensions of control reinforce each other, right? So if you lose political control, you don't get to decide, the use of force. To some degree, at least, you don't have control over for what purpose the force is used for. And it's more likely that it will not reflect prevailing social values. Her conceptual framework is really based on premise upon Weber's idea or criterion of statehood, that the state is really an entity that has a monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in a given territory, right? So if we see state as the monopoly of the legitimate use of force, by contracting out violence, local governments in China lose their monopoly of political control, which entails giving up some or all degree of functional control. So local governments may hire thugs to produce the desired outcome of forced relocation, but excessive violence may be used in the process that costs the lives of recalcitrant households. And city patrols and chengguan may hire auxiliary workers to upkeep order on the streets, but then excessive force are often used without qualms, causing physical harm to and result in violent clashes between them and street vendors and migrant workers. The other type of relationship which I can think of between state and these violent entrepreneurs are that of a patron-client relationship. The patron, that is the state, outsource certain policy implementation of state functions to the client, the violent entrepreneurs. Patron-client relationship is often characterized by symbiosis between the two parties. Local officials who are incapable of carrying out their functions or policies require assistance from these violent entrepreneurs. In exchange, the gangs and thugs are given financial compensation, or they may be given compensation in kind. So I once, spent some time in the village just outside of Kunming city, and really gangs and thugs rule that particular village. The local government, the village committees have very little state legitimacy, and they get the thugs and gangs to perform a wide range of things, from intimidating people to forcing people off their land. And in exchange, they actually give the rights to these violent entrepreneurs, the rights to collect rent from street vendors in the village. And these rents can really be seen as some sort of a protection fee, because if one refuses to pay the rent, you'll be inviting trouble, including physical harm to you or to your customers. And let's think about, why does the state need to hire thugs, right? I would argue that these are weak states, right? So weak states routinely co-opt coercive power of violent entrepreneurs to carry out their governance responsibilities, policy implementation, or simply to get jobs done. And we can define weak states along various dimensions. One is the Weberian, tradition of a strong bureaucracy and military. So even though these contract workers, they are strictly speaking, they are not part of the government bureaucracy. They are often given the impression to the citizens that they are, because when they go out and work alongside local officials, it could be difficult to tell the difference between the thugs and local officials. So in that respect, they have become part of the quasi-state apparatus. Therefore, these violent, illegitimate and unjustified acts by these highest thugs, in turn, reduces state strength. The other way to defined weak state is in terms of fiscal capacity. So following Margaret Levy and Douglas North, the ability to extract resources from society through taxation is one of the defining capabilities of the state. Fiscal capacity refers to the state's ability to raise sufficient revenues through direct taxation to fund basic public goods such as law and order, health and education, and this is a necessary prerequisite for state strength. And in order to in understanding the contribution of fiscal capacity to state strength, I think it is important to differentiate between direct taxation and indirect taxation. Indirect taxation is often referred to as non-tax revenues, such as intergovernmental transfers, fees and fines, and arbitrary exactions. They share many similar characteristics with oil revenue, unearned incomes, and windfalls. So while states acquire direct tax revenues through formal bureaucratic means and taxation machinery, the reverse is often true for indirect taxation. So there is quite a lot of literature on how states that rely on oil revenue, which could be seen as a form of indirect taxation, tend to have very weak democracy, tend to be non-democratic countries, because you don't really need a strong bureaucratic force which is often seen as necessary to get formal tax revenue from citizens. So if we were to look at China's situation through this theoretical lens, China went through a series of fiscal decentralization in the 80s, which devolved fiscal responsibilities from the central to local governments. But in 1994, there was a series of fiscal re-centralizations. Revenue was re-centralized back from local governments to central governments. But expenditures remain largely decentralized. So you have local governments with very little formal tax revenue, but with a lot of expenditure responsibilities. So there's this huge mismatch between revenue and expenditures of local governments. So in that sense, local governments in China have suffered a decline in formal fiscal capacity since 1994. And therefore that could be translated into weakening state capacity, right? And the consequence of declining formal tax revenue, while you also have a lot of responsibilities to provide expenditures to finance public goods and services, is that you have a lot of incentive to collect indirect taxation. In China literature, this is known as extra budgetary revenue, which are not subject to sharing with the central or higher level government. In the 90s, the major form of indirect taxation or extra budgetary revenue was those rural taxes and fees. And that was abolished in the mid-2000s, right? And after that, land income has become a predominant form of local government's extra budgetary revenue. And in order to collect these indirect taxation, violence and the co-optation of gangs as a coercive force has become necessary for these weak local states in their pursuit of indirect tax revenues. That is essentially my argument. I think the other way of looking at state strength, or how we would define weak state, is in terms of state legitimacy. So state legitimacy is not commonly included in the definition of state strength, but it is actually highly relevant to the ability and capacity of the state in carrying out policies, in implementing governance responsibilities. So following Bruce Gilley, state legitimacy has three constitutive elements. That is legality, whether an act or a policy is seen as legal in the eyes of the citizens. Justification, whether the actions or the policies are actually morally justified. And acts of consent, if it is seen as legal and morally justified, and you would naturally get consent. If not, you're unlikely to get consent from your citizens. Now, if a state has low legitimacy, either due to a lack of legality of its policies or poorly justified actions, citizens cannot be expected to abide by them. Therefore, a state with low legitimacy may have to resort to coercive power to acquire citizens' compliance to policies. I want to think about, let's think about what do these means for state strength, and what are the implications for state-society relationship. So in authoritarian China, where citizens cannot vote the one-party state out of office, people take their anger to the street, right? And people protest for a range of reasons, from land expropriation to violence by chengguan, to labor disputes, to a range of things. But if we take the frequency of social unrest, or what the Chinese government call mass incident, if that is taken as an indicator of social discontent, incidents related to land expropriation, eviction, and relocation from homes, the Chinese call chai qian, they actually account for about 2/3 of the total social unrest cases every year. So if we were to believe these commonly cited figure or estimates by a Tsinghua scholar called Sun Liping, he estimates that there are about 180,000 cases of mass incidents in China every year. 2/3 of that is related to land expropriation, demolition, and forced eviction. So if that is taken as an indicator, land expropriation and demolition is actually the issues that anger the population most, right? So increased violence have actually increased this frequency of social unrest and people's discontent against the state. And when a state is weak, either in terms of its fiscal capacity or low legitimacy, outsourcing work to a third party may seem beneficial in the short run. We talk about cost efficiency, we talk about job effectiveness. But it could actually be detrimental to the state in the long run. So by co-opting coercive forces of violent entrepreneurs as their own, the states may be able to collect more exactions, expropriate more land, or to demolish more houses that will bring them more revenue. But state legitimacy suffers as a result of unjustified use of violence and coercion. So these would contribute further to state weaknesses. So you get a vicious cycle of weak states beget weaker states. And you can possibly imagine that when a state has lost its legitimacy in its entirety, no one is going to listen to you. You could implement the policies and no one would follow it through. You get no compliance from citizens. You will have to resort to repressive measures and coercive forces in all aspects of governance and policy implementation. That will be, the extreme when the state has lost all legitimacy. And I think, in some parts of China, they are really getting there. So it becomes a vicious cycle when contracting of violence may seem a benefit to the state in the short run, but long run, it actually further erodes state strength and state legitimacy. I want to end the presentation with an observation. So about state-society relation in rural China. So the term patron-client relationship has been used by various scholars. Jean Oy, in her earlier work back in the 90s and early 80s, has used clientelism to describe the relationship between rural cadres and peasants. I've also used similar concepts to describe the relationship between local party leaders and local business elites in my earlier work. I think while that conceptualization of state-business relationship is still valid, what this study has highlighted is the emergence of another pervasive and prominent form of patron-client relationship in China, that is between the state and violent entrepreneurs. So I think this may actually fundamentally change our understanding of statehood and state society relations. Numerous scholars, including Bruce Dixon and Kelly Tai, have studied the power and the political ascent of the wealthy business entrepreneurs and the middle class. Even though they may be fighting for democracy, they have increased political power to do various things, right? And the state wanted to co-opt them. Well, what this study highlights is that the relationship between state and businesses remain very important. But I think we should also pay greater attention to the rise of violent entrepreneurs, to thugs and gangsters, and start thinking about their relationship with the state. Okay. Thank you for your attention. So I'm quite happy to take questions and comments. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk, and thank you for coming to Ann Arbor. In the earliest portion, or earlier in your talk, you seem to stress the role of less sophisticated, less organized groups of thugs and the state using them for hire. And I was wondering if there's any evidence yet as to the relationship between more organized forms of crime in cities, mafias and things of that sort, and then these less organized cells or groups of thugs, if they are in conflict at any time, or if the more organized crime groups, syndicates, what have you, actually also employ these less sophisticated and less organized thugs, in which case there's sort of a side patron-client exchange going on in parallel with the state's patron-client
Right.
relationship that's going on, and if this in any way affects the political, social, or functional control dimensions
Right.
highlighted in your presentation.
Right. So the case study that I looked at briefly about the guy called Chelsea in Harbin, when he was caught in the 2000 and put on trial, as I understand, his criminal network was actually very extensive. He was involved in all sorts of vices and businesses, from entertainment to whatever you can think of. He was wealthy underground criminal thugs, think Godfather, think, Sopranos, But he actually started as offering service of thugs for hire, before he got rich. What he offered was violent act for hire for the state, and same as the other guy called Liu Yong in Shenyang. So is there a relationship between the two of them? I would say yes. They will start very small as thugs for hire, working for state, and after that they got bigger, and then they get into construction, entertainment, and other illegal businesses. There is actually some studies by criminologists on, say, the criminal gangs in Chongqing and the relationship with the government, the protection umbrella, right? How local officials in Chongqing would provide protection to the criminal gangs. There is some studies on protection umbrella in that sense. So to answer your question, there's definitely evidence of relationship between the two, from small to big. But what I am concerned with in this paper is really about the early stage of their development, because that I think I am more interested in what it means to the state rather than the development of the criminal gangs as such. So my angle is a little bit different. Yes, Luisa?
I wanted to ask about the growth of the stability maintenance machine and stability maintenance funding. I mean, has that allowed an extra pool of resources, do you think, for local governments to use on contracting out violence? Is there any kind of research on this at all?
It is always challenging to get a question from a journalist. I can only speculate that the massive funds, at least under Zhou Yongkang, for maintenance of social stability, would only increase the budget available for dealing with recalcitrant households, for dealing with protesters and petitioners. So that would increase the funding available for hiring thugs. But this is something that I will have to look into further in my next field research. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for coming for giving us a talk. I have two questions.
Right.
So the first one, you mentioned that the cost of the violent entrepreneur is the weak state. But in the short term, what do you think is the effective alternative solutions in implementing some pretty short term? And my second question is, since the violent entrepreneur is a business, so what if some private company and or the people from the rural area, they hire those us to advocate for them or implement their missions? What can the government do to when those violence groups is against the government?
Interesting. So to answer your first question, what is the alternative solution? So I came from a background of studying taxation, intergovernment, and how it affects intergovernmental relations. And I would go back to my taxation argument. There's a huge mismatch between revenue and expenditures for local governments in China, right? Um, and and I talked about weakening fiscal capacity of local government states earlier. I think in the short run, there is no quick solution. They are tasked with implementing a lot of policies of financing public goods and services, but they don't have sufficient revenue. I think to fundamentally reform and to find a solution is to really look at how revenue is being distributed among different levels of government, so that you have government that is tasked, that is given the responsibility to finance public services, are given sufficient revenue to do so. I don't think there's any good solution in the short run. Are the thugs being hired by the citizens to protest against government? I'm not aware of, but I think that's a potential interesting idea. I mean, if they are really, if they are out there to provide services, if the citizens could afford them, why not, right? Yeah, no, interesting. Yes, ma'am.
The first question has to do with bookkeeping. So normally for us,
Right.
normally if there is a illegitimate way of expenditure, that surfaces when bookkeeping shows something weird. So I was wondering if there's some kind of a check system outside of the registers of expenditure, etc., that you probably have seen in your research, and how they would write the particular funds that go to thugs and so on. So I'm just curious what they would write for that, or maybe not. There's no need to do so. I don't know, but you must have seen something interesting there. And the other question is, how do countries outside of China deal with this very flexible and interesting but difficult situation, both in trade and
bookkeeping. So, as Yuan would know, because she does similar research to tax revenues in China are divided into budgetary revenue, that are the formal taxes that would be registered on government books, and then you have a bunch of extra budgetary revenue. Some of them are probably recorded, others are probably not recorded. It's really up to the local government. And if you were to record it, you can always underestimate the true magnitude. The major differences between the two are that formal revenue, they are subject to sharing among different levels of government. But extra budgetary revenue, major proportion of it is land income now. They're actually not subject to sharing. So if I'm a local government of officials, I want to keep as much revenue to myself. There's less incentive to collect tax revenue, which I have to share, right? So what's the point? But there's a lot of incentive to collect land income, which I can keep it more or less almost to myself. On what the international community is doing about this, I'll say nothing. I've seen a lot of press reports about violence being used, but I haven't really come across any paper, maybe one or two, about thugs and violence, or the emergence of thugs and violence in China. Mary?
So I have heard of examples where protesters do contract out with thugs for labor disputes and for medical disputes. Ben Liebman has a paper about medical disputes, and you can, when a patient dies or suffers some kind of malpractice, the family they can hire additional people to protest against the doctors and nurses, and that's why doctors and nurses in China are often well defended in terms of some maybe like shields and things, because they have a lot of threat of physical violence. And I had an offer last year when I was in China to go interview one of these organizers of protests for labor, but I thought I didn't want to interview someone affiliated probably with the mafia, so I declined the opportunity.
Right.
The question I have is whether or not it's a follow-up on another question about, you think that the way to solve this is to give local governments the to delegate more authority to them to extract revenue legally. But I don't know if this will actually work, because in 2005, one of the reasons why they lifted the agricultural tax was because local people did not, there was so much contention between local governments and citizens about tax revenue collection. So I think the critical issue is this issue you pointed, which is the lack of the legitimacy of local governments in China. And how will that be solved by giving them more responsibility, unless you also give them some kind of, I'm not talking about necessarily democratic reform, but somehow they have to be both accountable and responsible.
Right, that's a good point. I think what I meant for fiscal reform is not necessarily giving local governments more revenue, but to match revenue responsibility with expenditure responsibilities. So you can actually re-centralize a lot of expenditure responsibilities, because since you have re-centralized a lot of revenue, I think financing of public goods and services, most of the money could actually come from higher level government, which they have actually starting to do, but it's still, there's still a big gap between revenue and expenditures. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Yes.
I just, as a Qing historian, I can't help but reflecting on law enforcement in China's past. You treat this a little bit like an aberration from a kind of Bavarian norm, but if you think about the Qing state or the Ming state,
right.
Or at least the Qing state in my case, the police force in China were criminals in uniform. Right. That was the norm. You hired people who were criminals, you prosecute with other criminals, and right. Then state-funded military, banners with the green banners like right. The PLA and the PAP, but right. Isn't this kind of a reversion to right. A normal? Could it be that it's only we that see the problem and that people actually see this as a natural state of affairs?
No, you are absolutely right. The reason why I have not mentioned history is really I don't know very much about what's going on in the Qing period, but from what I have read, Maoist China, if you were to take a long-term view of history in China, what happened in Maoist China where all these gangs were wiped out, it was really an aberration. So we're actually returning to norm. But, that's no excuse for, not talking about it.
It's never an excuse. I'm thinking about an explanation.
Yeah. So the reason for the wiping out of gangs and criminal gangs in Maoist China is that it was very strong party apparatus penetrating into the society, and you have very strict hukou system to stop people from moving around, right? And relaxation of communist control is actually a good thing, but what has come with it is declining state capacity, which then encourage a bunch of other things such as this. That is going on now. Yes, ma'am.
We've been talking about this in terms of unfunded mandates for the local government to get something done. But I would think that a lot of the driving force would be the desire of some of the locals, siphon the money into their own pockets. And the other thing that's said is that within the United States and so forth, local communities have the ability to manage what they want to get. You want to have erosion. Country politicians can say that you're going to pay the taxes and have erosion. Big governments have already said just how much taxes and let's say this, that, and the other amount. So there's more control at this individual levels in terms of the particular values and different sectors.
Yeah, so back in the 90s, in rural areas, when they want to build a bridge, they would go out and collect, fees and taxes from peasants. And if from the local government perspective, they don't want to do so, they wouldn't. There's no need to impose that sort of exactions from the people. And of course, there's a lot of corruption within the fiscal system. a lot of revenue, you might give them more money, more tax revenue. A lot of that might go into, officials might go, end up lining up officials' pocket. I'm sure that happens. But leaving that aside, I think there is also a lot of implications as far as formal taxation is concerned. Right. Exactly. Yes, sir.
Two questions. First one, what regulations does the nation or province impose on local governments in terms of taxation? Do they prevent certain types of taxation? And the second question, I assume that if they appoint a gang to take care of a task, some of the gangs will pay back the person who chose them. Has that been recorded frequently?
What do you mean by payback?
Well, you give $1,000 to the gang, and they quietly, without saying anything, give part of it back to you, the person who chose you.
I'm sure that exists. Yeah. So on your first question about regulation, so formal tax revenues are regulated. There are certain taxes in China that local governments can impose, can collect. But outside formal tax revenue, there's also this miscellaneous category of extra budgetary revenue, which a lot of things could come under that. It could be traffic fines. It could be some miscellaneous fees for violating certain laws and regulations. Back in the 90s, in rural areas, it was rural fees from violating one-child policy to all sorts of miscellaneous fees to help construction of bridges, schools, and so on. But those rural taxes and fees were abolished in the 2000s. Nowadays, as I've said earlier, the major category of extra budgetary revenue is land income. That's why you have this massive real estate boom going on in China, which a lot of people are saying that it's going to burst very soon because government officials, there's a lot of incentive government officials to them to expropriate land, convert the land into commercial housing, real estate, develop the properties. They get a lot of land income and real estate revenue. And that leads to ever rising property prices, which is in their interest. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks for the talk. My question may be a little silly. I'm wondering what the central government's attitude towards this, because in China I have noticed that many newspapers and especially social media have reports about this violence, and we can see the videos and pictures of these incidents. I mean, the central government must know about this. What their attitude, what they do, or they just know quietly and don't do nothing about it.
I don't think there's any specific policies by the central government. I think some central state agent may be hiring violent entrepreneurs of their own. But I think the recent reform effort to trying to address land rights of peasants is actually trying to indirectly tackle the problem. So by giving peasants more rights over their land, hopefully their bargaining power vis-a-vis local government officials will improve. Then that would help ameliorate some of the problems that we have seen here. Yeah. Yes, at the back.
Yeah, are there any like conflicts
I'm sure there are. I just haven't come across any. There are, in some village election, some local gangs have basically, they have enough money to to buy votes that they just become elected officials. So they are going down the path of Kuomintang, call it 漂白. They are turning from black to white. They're going from underground to above ground operation.
Can I ask the last question?
Sure.
So it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, I think, because I don't think this is a new project, so you haven't made it comparative yet, but I think making it more comparative in the end will be really interesting because one of the things that I thought of when you talked about the evictions is the movie about Japan called The Taxing Woman, which is also about the use of thugs in Japan to do either evictions and also for corporate board meetings. I don't know if that's happened in China yet either. And in South Korea as well, this kind of subcontracting out of violence to private security has happened a lot. So, but also I just think there's something in comparative politics about when criminal gangs and politicians work together, and it's part of American history as well. So it's interesting to sort of wonder, is this kind of a developmental stage for China, or is this something like going back in history, or is it something entirely new?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Actually, one of your recent graduates wrote to me. He did his dissertation on and gangs of violence in South Korea, but unfortunately he is in Japan, so I couldn't meet him. I've read up on a little bit on comparative literature and also on warlord politics, which is absolutely fascinating. So I agree with you. There's a lot written on countries outside China. I think it's very much worth looking at. Yeah, I just haven't gotten around doing so. So that would most logically be the next step. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.